Hey gang, today we're going to cover what to play over certain chord progressions, and we're going to talk about modes from the point of view of which major scale fits this particular chord progression. Now, that's not the only way of thinking about it, but it's one way and it's an effective way, so that's what we're going to focus on today. One other thing I want to show you is that one of the things I've noticed about modal players, including myself when I did this, is we start to sound very scaly. We start to sound very, which is fine in and of itself, but all the stuff that got us to the dance, that stuff goes by the wayside. You don't have to let it go by the wayside. And when you start to learn about modes, the tendency is to start thinking about modes as if there is a correct way of thinking about it, and the mode is the only correct way. And that's just a false way of thinking. It's not a good way of thinking about it. We're going to be able to take things from the minor pentatonic. We're going to be able to take things from chord tones, all the rest of that stuff, and put it together with the modes. So let's explore a piece today where we're going to do that, okay? I'll take you through first the piece itself, and then I'll do a couple of demos. One just using the modes that are correct, and the other adding in some other cool notes. All right? All right, gang, let's give this a listen and let's note the chords as they go by, and then we'll talk about what modes or what scales fit each section. There's two sections here. Here we go. Here's the first one. It's basically a D. It's a suspended second chord, but it's a D. Here's a C. Now a G. Back to a D. Okay, now it's going to repeat again. So D, C, and G, and back to D. Okay, now here's part B. A, G, D, A. A, G, D, A. A, G, D, A. Now a little bit different. E minor, G, and we're back to part one. All right. So this is kind of a cool progression. There's two of them. Let's talk about part A. And the way I like to think about this, the way that this method is going to work, is you got to think about over the chords in part A, which are D, C, G, and back to D. What major scale fits that? And the answer is G. And here's the easiest way to think about it. Whenever you see two majors, like in this case D and C, which are one step apart from each other, you should think, oh, that's the 4 chord and the 5 chord. So C is the 4 chord and D is the 5 chord, and therefore G is the key. All right? G is the next chord that's in there. So all of those chords fit into the key of G. Now most people would say because you start on D, or and actually in this case we're using suspended second. But that's okay, it doesn't really change the progression materially. Most people would say because you're starting with D, you're going to call this D mixolydian. Mixolydian is the scale that's built off the 5th degree of the major scale. So it's D mixolydian. D mixolydian and G major are equivalent in terms of notes. All right? So that's that. So that's part one. Let's talk about part two. And part two is A, G, D, A. Now right away you can tell that there's a key change because you've got A and G, two major chords, one step apart from each other. So using that same rule that we used before, let's guess that A is the 5 chord, G is the 4 chord, and that would make D the 1 chord. Okay, so this, most people would say, is you play A mixolydian over this, which is which is the equivalent of playing the key of D major. Okay? A is the 5th degree of D major, therefore A Mixolydian is the mode that goes with D major scale. Okay? Is the Mixolydian mode that goes with the 5th degree of the D major scale. So, all of this discussion, what we come down to is we'll play the D Mixolydian over the first part and the A Mixolydian over the second part. Or you could think of simply over part A, we're going to play the G major scale. Over part B, we're going to play the D major scale. Okay, those are the notes that are there. Whenever you convert to the major scale, however, I want to caution you, when you do that, you still have to be mindful of the chords. We don't want to just run up and down the scale because it's going to sound meandering and kind of bad. All right, so we want to avoid that. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you a demo of first just playing those modes. We'll play them purely, okay? So over the first part, I'll just play the D Mixolydian, and over the second part, I'll just play the A Mixolydian, okay? So that's what I'm going to go to. All right. All right, well, as I said before, you don't only have to play the D Mixolydian over the first chord sequence and the A Mixolydian over the second chord sequence. You can still play the things that, as I said, got us to the dance, and that is our minor pentatonic. So in this case, we might want to sometimes substitute in the A minor pentatonic over the second chord sequence and the D minor pentatonic over the first chord sequence. So over this, we might want to play that on occasion, something like that. The other thing that we can think of is just because we're playing a mode doesn't mean that we can't play some real chord tones or focus on the chord tones. So for example, you might want to play that kind of thing over the D, and over the C you might want to play something like this. Which is really just notes from a chord. All right, so this time around I'm going to blend some of the stuff that I did before and just playing the modes, and some of the times, using some of the other tricks that are there that, again, made us guitar players to begin with. Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed this one, and I hope you can see that, number one, figuring out what modes to play using the major scale method on the chord progression is a pretty powerful way of doing it. It's pretty straightforward. You figure out which major scale fits certain chords, and you play the mode accordingly, okay? In this case, we played Mixolydian because each of the chord progressions started on the 5 chord, all right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is you don't only have to play the modes. You have other choices. Other choices sound good to your ears. You should use them. And we should still remember we're guitar players. We're still remember we're rock guitar players for the most part. And we can pull out those stops. Hope you enjoyed this one. Hope you got something out of it. And we'll see you on down the road.